All right, people are entering our Zoom room. And as we continue to welcome more people, I'll offer an official welcome and introduction to today's event. First of all, my name is Shannon Jackson. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for the Arts Plus Design at Berkeley and Hadidi Professor here as well. And it's a privilege to welcome you to the 5th program in A+D Thursdays. As many of you hopefully know by now, this course sits inside of a large public course that we created in order to introduce students to a range of art forms across the visual arts, performance, cinema, literature, and design. And that we do this course every semester in a way that opens to the public once a week. So every Thursday, we're privileged to welcome an array of distinguished visiting speakers. We've already welcomed a number of incredible artists and curators over the last couple of weeks. Next week, we're excited to be welcoming Electronic Arts Intermix Director Rebecca Clemen, Boston Cyber Arts Director George Fifield, and the pathbreaking curator and critic in the field of time-based media, Barbara London. Let me also say that as we explore throughout the entire semester this wide and rangy field in time-based media art, we're also excited to be adding 2 Tuesdays to our Thursday lecture series in order to accommodate the schedules of 2 renowned, internationally renowned artists. First of all, William Kentridge, who will be zooming in from South Africa next Tuesday, February 23rd at noon. And also, we're very privileged to be welcoming the extraordinary filmmaker and video artist Steve McQueen on Tuesday, March 30th, also at noon. We hope that you'll tune in to them and tune into everything that we have to offer this semester. Before I proceed further, I want to acknowledge the land on which we gather, the land on which our campus stands. The UC Berkeley is sited on the unceded and ancestral land of the Ohlone people. And as we gather here today, virtually, online or offline, we recognize not only the Ohlone's history, but also the fact that the Ohlone people are vital, flourishing members of the Berkeley community and the Bay Area writ large. While all of us believe Berkeley to be a special place, we know we are not the first to recognize or celebrate this place that we have the privilege of calling our campus. If you have been following us so far throughout these last few weeks or read any of our work online, you know that we're exploring time-based media art, and you know that we're doing so in a way that really considers the politics and aesthetics of place, even if placeness is in some ways experienced on the screen and online right now. Through the exploration of time-based media, we're thinking about how artists use these hybrid forms in order to address pressing social issues from around the globe, and especially for thinking about the politics and aesthetics of the screen that is connecting and sometimes disconnecting us even now as I speak. Our exploration this entire semester is indebted to a generous donation from the Cramlick Art Foundation. All of us tuning in now we are here because of the generosity of that foundation. And we're always now deeply grateful for their commitment to research and education in the field of time-based media. Indeed, when we think now about the nature of on-screen interaction, which of course we're thinking about quite a bit these days, we might remember our debt to a coterie of experimental artists who, at the very beginning, began to think about what the impact of video technology and the impact of broadcast technologies might be on our conceptions of self, our conceptions of society, our conceptions of the local, our conceptions of the global. Nam June Paik is one such experimental artist to whom we are indebted, whether we know it or not. And in order to understand his influence, I don't think we could have a better interpreter and ambassador than Rudolf Frieling. For our Bay Area world in time-based media art, Frieling needs no introduction. He is the curator of media arts at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where he is at the center of an experimental world, serving as curator, as critic, advisor, enabler, convener, rainmaker, and as a collaborator to all of us around some of the most significant exhibitions and significant artists in this field. After moving here from ZKM in Germany, one of the foremost international hubs for emerging media art, he has collaboratively conceived a range of exhibitions. I won't be listing all of them here, but I'll note the art of participation, as well as perhaps more recently with Tanya Zimbardo, soundtracks, all of these exhibitions that share some of the most exciting new artistic work and historical artistic work in the field, and that also reconfigure in many ways the nature of the exhibition format. He, with all of his colleagues there, have come to make the 7th floor the place to be at SFMOMA, and it will continue to be the place to be when we are all allowed to be together once again in a post-vaccine world. So I know all of you are muted, but I hope you will all join me in thanking Rudolf Frieling for his time today and for offering a disquisition on Paik that I know will combine rigor and adventure as we all learn not what Nam June Paik can do for you, but what you can do for Nam June Paik. So Rudolf, over to you.
All right. Guess I'm live now. What you do see is a weird mix of a part of my office at the museum, but also you see a glimpse of the Nam June Paik show that is coming to us in May, opening May 8th, here in its first installment at Tate Modern. 2019, that was, before the pandemic hit. Well, first of all, thanks to Janan for your invite. When I said yes, I could not know what an amazing roster of speakers you have lined up. Kudos, I've been able to follow almost every one of them so far. I also want to acknowledge, obviously, your whole team, Paris and Caitlin, who are with us today, but also my co-curator of the Nam June Paik show, Soo-Kyung Lee at Tate Modern, as well as our own assistant curator, Andrea Nichi-Krupp, who is helping me tremendously in mounting all the details and finishing all the details for the Paik show that is just about to be installed as we speak. You may wonder what a strange title I chose. And of course, that was just a moment when I was as well, you know, how shall we call this? And I did that by basically looking at what Nam June Paik did. Somehow I get a message here. Okay, that was just. I did that by looking at Nam June Paik's own words and thoughts and writings. And so, believe it or not, this is an adaptation of a quote by the artist himself. And the original quote was, "Don't ask what cello can do for me, but ask what I can do for cello." And that, of course, if we can go to the first slide, is a direct reference to his longtime collaborator, Charlotte Moorman, and their famous TV cello and many performances that you will come across also in our show. On the left, you see that Paik himself could become the cello. On the right, you see the installation that ended up being exhibited in museums, but the performances throughout almost a decade, if not longer, really defined much of his career. And I'm taking this moment to just acknowledge that his collaborators, his friends, Charlotte Moorman first and foremost, but also obviously John Cage, who influenced him deeply, Joseph Beuys, Merce Cunningham, Shuya Abe, and many others. Those were lifelong friends and collaborators, and it is one of the defining features of our show. Whenever possible, we actually dedicate entire rooms to these collaborations. Another key aspect of our exhibition, and also our rethinking or maybe reviewing of Paik's impact, is a specific focus on, let's say, on his biography as an artist born in Korea, who emigrated to Japan, then to Germany, then to the US, and through that trajectory became basically what we would call a transnational artist. However, rooted very much in a very peculiar mix of Eastern and Western philosophies that really sketched out his horizon of his entire career in really interesting ways, and ways that are still not really explored so far. I'm saying that because obviously, you know, being the curator of media arts, it is the one touchstone that is recognized by almost everybody universally, globally, that he invented video art, that he's the father of a whole field that became later on media art, if you will. And that is something that will obviously play a huge role for us as well, but we also wanted to look beyond that. And so the Eastern Western philosophies, the thoughts, his writings, all of those were deeply impactful for us. And so that's the next slide, where you see a moment for him how to reflect on his really hybrid identity, on his multiple cultural legacies. And if you can find a way to combine your birthday with Jackie Onassis, with Graf von Stauffenberg, who attempted a murder of Hitler on his birthday, as well as the landing on the moon, and then his father and himself on the little picture on the left. That sort of gives you a sense of his thinking and the complexities of his world, if you will. Trying to combine all of these things also with logic and math and electronics, not without humor, as you can see here as well. Next slide is then much more poignant in his way of addressing his hybrid biography and his hybrid culture, and something he really cherished and cultivated in many ways. So Yellow Peril, C'est moi, is obviously a reference to French kings, emperors who thought that they were the state. It was used by the German emperor early 20th century as a reflection on the impact of China and Japan on Europe. And it was always associated with something that was sort of dark, that had a charged political and even violent history. And for him, taking this on in an almost exuberant way, in a sort of humorous and maybe satirical way, gives you an impression of who he is. And then signing that both in Korean and Japanese adds a level of legibility for some or illegibility for others to everything he's done and everything he's written. So those are just preliminary thoughts on the kind of things we were interested in exploring. And the idea that whoever interviewed Paik would know it was so hard to understand him, but reading Paik is an eye-opening experience. So I'll come back to that throughout my lecture with choice quotes from the artist himself, who, by the way, also said, "Don't correct my English," which is a challenge for all copy editors in our museum and everywhere in the world. And he continued in that quote, "The 60s are over. It is time to disrupt English grammar after having disrupted FCC TV lines." And FCC is an acronym for the Federal Communication Commission. So for him, his language was an integral component of who he was and how he related to his international group of friends. And if we go to the next slide, we see that reflected as well in the invite to his very first exhibition, the famous Exposition of Music, Electronic Television from 1963. Here you see an invite which was sent out, a print on daily Korean paper, a print that is hard to read. Again, I can let you know though that it combines both German, English, as well as French, and of course, Korean in the background, as a peculiar mix that would hide as much as it would reveal. It formed a sort of thought horizon for his show, but it was actually printed before he changed the title of the show to Exposition of Music, Electronic Television. And I'll come to that in a moment. But this show, which you could argue made art history in that for the first time it really put artistic interventions into television on an art historical map, of course not recognized at the time, that only emerged over the decades. But it was the first time that an artist managed to literally influence and intervene in and change the patterns and the circuitry of a television apparatus, rather than, you know, treating television as an object, as a sculpture, or as a feed of program only. The next one is something that is probably impossible for you to read right now, but it almost provided us with a different title to the show. This is a manifesto called Post Music, and was from 1962. And it just serves for me as a reminder that Paik came out of a career of a composer, of studying music, of performing music, and that he continued to basically develop his oeuvre out of a sense of disrupting and changing music and the traditions of music, and then of course expanding that to art as well. So the next slide gives us a short excerpt from that, which, if I may read this: post music is as calm, as cold, as dry, as non-expressionistic as my television experiments. But why is it music? Because it is not music. And this idea that something is not what you define it, that it could be different from that, from any tradition, and yet not just reject music, not just be anti-music, not just be anti-television for that matter. That is a really key moment to understand in studying Paik. And the next slide is maybe one of the most drastic examples of him dealing with the tradition of music by literally changing, preparing, as he called it. You know, these are prepared pianos, following the example of John Cage in his first show in 1963. But surprisingly, what you see on the left is the remnant and the relic of an intervention by Joseph Beuys, unplanned, in which he took an axe and literally simply destroyed one of three pianos in the show, for the show, as an homage to Paik, who did not know about this, but actually embraced the gesture, embraced that as an expression of what he called a music. So all of this is today history and art history, and you wonder, you know, when is he finally going to come to television? So just bear with me. The point that I'm trying to make here as well is the music was there to be played, and not by a performer, not by a musician or pianist, but by the public. And the title, Exposition of Music, was literally the move and the shift from performing music to exposing music, to exhibiting music as a spatial configuration. And he did that for music, but he also did that for television. And of course, today, these pianos are in museums and nobody's allowed to play them anymore. You might not want to anyway, because it was at times a violent act to play this kind of piano. So post music is a fascinating manifesto to read, and I encourage you to read that closely in the exhibit. Here's one first quote for Paik. As the next step towards indeterminacy, a term he obviously took from Cage, I wanted the audience to act and play by itself. So I have resigned the performance of music, I expose the music. He took over the space of a bourgeois gallery, a bourgeois villa by an architect slash gallerist, Parnasse, and literally occupied the space that he was given in his radical, expansive way of placing his artwork that were then produced for the show. So remember, this is still his very first show. He had a few performances earlier than that in salons in West Germany, but he had secretly, for this show, developed a series of interventions into television, which he displayed for the first time here because he felt that music was a territory where he was not excelling as a performer. He was definitely not excelling as a composer. He was okay, he was mediocre, but he was looking for a field to explore, being the first in this. Still very much indebted to a notion of an avant-garde artist. And he identified television and electronics as that field where no one had been before. So the next slide. This is not yet television, but it moves us to a realm of electronics and electronic recordings here of audio tapes, and the idea that an audio tape can be interacted with in unforeseen ways, in very subjective ways, and in random ways. Hence, this is called random access. Nothing might eventually be formed and be experienced as music in the traditional sense, but as sound, as silences, as noise, and maybe even also as music, all of that in a mix. And then when we come to the next one, the next picture, we see how, how he was indebted to Cage for very obvious reasons. And I'm not going into the whole history with Cage right now. This is just an expression, a piece we will have in the show to just signal how much he was influenced by Paik, to then also think of not just silence music, but also silent TV, as you can see here in his writing. Next one. So from silent music, random access, to Zen for TV. And here we have another beautiful, I think, beautiful quote by Paik: as boring as possible, like Proust, Palestrina, Zen, Gregorian chant, Missa, Parisian cafe, life, sex, and dogs staring into the distance. What are we looking at here? We are looking basically at a glitch at a TV that arrived broken at the venue, and instead of discarding it, he turned it upside down to make it a vertical line. So what he found was a line, a television cathode ray tube that was diminished to a single line, a whole TV program, still live, still having sound, but only the ultimate reduction in a white line. So the idea that an accident, a glitch, something that's broken can be turned on its head, can be made productive, again, was there at the very first moment and proved to be essential and foundational for his entire practice. So imagine this one line at the opening. If you were there in 1963 in Germany, where there was just one TV program, which would start late afternoon, hence the show was only on view in the late afternoon, early evening. And you hear the voice of John F. Kennedy via the evening news before his death, or the soundtrack of Akira Kurosawa's feature film, Drunken Angel, which was incidentally broadcast on German television the evening of the opening on March 11th. Then you get a sense of how this might have produced a really different take on television, on something that was still a national pastime. It was one television program for an entire nation till later in 1963, when a second program was added. And that sense that you could work with television, but also work with what happens with the random and chance encounters is the one important pillar. And the next one, if we switch to the next slide. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this one. Let's move on and go right to here. Sorry, go back. Yes. If you go to the, okay, let me just move on here. If you go to his thinking, where he identified this minimalist gesture of Zen for TV, and later on related that to the early videotapes that were all simple, long durational black and white takes on typically performances, oftentimes called extremely boring. And he was adamant that one should embrace that, but that one could also just embrace the opposite of this. Hence, he's saying, why people are asking me why I'm not making any more boring videotapes. And later on, he says, I would rather be corrupted than repeating the sublime, which is, of course, is not what he actually did, but he did that as well. He stayed true to his minimalist beginnings throughout his life, but also he moved away from that. He was not to be defined by that one early gesture. And now the next one. And here we have a tape that we're going to play. Paris, are you playing this?
Yeah, well, what about anti-television?
Anyway, this is one-line television. And it's like, people ask me why you make so exciting, not boring videotapes. My answer is my first early 60s, I did intensely, minimal art, minimal aesthetics, boring, Before that word came off, so I don't want to repeat my early days, I would rather be corrupted than repeating this sublime age.
But how do you get that?
You know how I got always mistakes? Very often you have this stage of a TV set at home. When vertical thing breaks down, it becomes like that. And you call repairman, And I brought actually this TV set to gallery. And it got broken, and only on this shape was not interesting. I said, oh, I would not show. Then I said, oh, maybe I turn around here, like that. And then I put title Zen for TV, So that's it, and it became the best piece.
Well, Nam June, we were...
Okay, thanks. I'm also not going to go too much into the whole Buddhism part that he reflected on and incorporated into his work. He did Zen for Head, Zen for Wind. Are we back with the presentation? Okay. Yeah, let's go to the next one. Yes, this one. So this Zen attitude is mixed with his wonderful sense of humor. I'm actually very proud to say that SFMOMA was able to recently acquire this really historic sculpture from 1968 called TV Chair, which of course incorporates a closed circuit video camera and a monitor under a seat, sort of 60s fashionable design seat. On the right, you see a version he did later, where he's actually sitting on the chair. And if you remind yourself for a moment, or if you sort of picture yourself for a moment to be sitting on that chair, you of course would not see an image of yourself. Your back would see the image, so in quotation marks. And that's that moment where that closed circuit is interrupted, where your natural narcissism is interrupted, where that representation of yourself on the screen is complicated. I think that is another very typical and fundamental Paik intervention and gesture. The next one. And that's the last work from that early series that I want to talk about. Magna Tv from the Whitney collection is an amazing experience live when you see the vibrancy of that image, but it also reminds us that, excuse me, that one can make very physical interventions, that one can change the inner workings, the circuitry, by applying, for example, a magnet, a strong one for this. So as you also see here, this is about as much about the circuitry and the coils around a cathode ray tube and the changing of the magnetic field inside the apparatus, as it is about the beauty and the aesthetics of an abstraction, of an abstracted image. And when you see the next image, I was able to take these pictures being super interested in the way that this looks like a scrappy old TV, even back then in the 60s. Stop, let's go back. And on the right, you see that he opened the inside to, to the viewers. And what you may not know, though, is that such a strong magnet is potentially destructive to the circuitry and the screen, and it could ultimately destroy the apparatus. So the magnet has to be moved from time to time, which obviously was an invitation to the public at the time to do that themselves, to generate different configurations of abstraction. And today we're hoping that we can do that, as we have to do for conservation reasons, that we will do that as a way to engage with the public and have a dialogue about the nature of this work. So to make a first conclusion here, what he shows us and what he teaches us still today is that in order to fundamentally change the workings of a machine, an apparatus, you have to go inside the system. You cannot just change the surface. You have to operate at that structural engineering level in this case, or if you transpose that to today's problems, you have to start coding and programming, and not just buy off-the-shelf software, which can still produce pretty pictures, make no mistake. But he opens the circuits and he opens it to participation and feedback. I think those three are key components that run through his entire career. Next slide, please. So here you see an installation shot from the Kunsthalle Bremen, where you see a work that's called 3-camera participation. If you like Olafur Eliasson or Eliasson, this is where it's all coming from. The idea of exploring color by exploring the technology, exploring the idea of participation through technological means. And it may produce very simple forms of interaction only, like dancing, like just playing, a playful interaction with your shadows, etc. But it does point to the specifics of the medium, in this case, video technology, and the color spectrum of video, as well as this idea that this could potentially be television. So the next slide is actually about participation TV, what he called participation TV, and we're going to see an interaction that is based on the coupling of music or sound and the electronic image. Okay, that's enough. Thanks. Thanks. I think we've seen enough. You know, at the end of the day, he was not an engineer. He was not a technician as much as he tried to be one and to learn. But he relied heavily on the collaboration with a Japanese engineer called Shuya Abe, whom he met in Japan in the mid-60s, and who helped him also develop what was later called a video synthesizer. And here you see some impressions of results of that. A piece of equipment of editing software that was developed with the help of a Boston-based TV station called WGBH. And the money he took from them for the production of a TV program had this lasting influence in that it provided him a tool with which he could endlessly manipulate an electronic recording, which at the time was literally not in the hands of artists at all. And some of those interventions, you know, we're going to see two short examples. The first one is based on the idea of an appropriation of existing footage, the disruption of existing footage. And this one is an excerpt of Video Film Concert with a piece called Videotape Study Number 3 from 67 to 69. And the second one will be called Beatles Electronique. And then we'll talk a little bit more about that. All right, that's enough for this one. Thanks. Not sure, Paris, if you've lined up the second excerpt as well. So what obviously, I mean, bear with us. The quality of this by Zoom is, of course, terrible. So it's just, let's say it's a document, it's an indication of what you might be experiencing. But keep in mind, this was a live experimentation in a TV studio, and in a piece that we want to come back to towards a little bit later, called Video Commune. He actually invited artists as well as people from the street, the public, into a TV studio to help him just generate patterns and work with a video synthesizer. So it's almost like a jam session, producing an ad hoc video clip to the music of the Beatles. Looks like Paris, we need to move on. I'm also running a little bit late here, so let's just skip the next one. Okay. One of the most extraordinary jumps in imagination is the idea that you do not just create your own tools, you do not just create your own space, but you actually occupy a space inside the larger machine, which is television. Television, of course, as that communication system, as that state network or regional network, or wherever you get a chance to work as an artist. And I think for Paik, this was as much a chance to just use that space as it was a chance to actually connect with a much broader audience. And the first time he did that, of course, in the late 60s, he contributed pieces for WGBH, for example, then for WNET in New York. But the true first global moment came in 1977 when he was invited next to Joseph Beuys in the middle here and Douglas Davis on the right to take over 10 minutes of a live satellite cast from Documenta in Kassel, Germany. And it was a stunning moment of interpretation, 3 diverse artistic responses to an open platform on national television. And the German announcer and moderator made a point in saying early on that they did not take responsibility for what was about to happen. So Paik basically gave a variety show of his performances, including Charlotte Moorman. Joseph Beuys gave an activist political speech around social sculpture and the need to take action in politics and democracy. And Douglas Davis tried to address very directly the idea of interaction with the public by touching a screen, which was live from Caracas, Venezuela. This in turn then, that was just half an hour, this in turn prompted Paik to then actually think much more globally and to expand his vision onto a scale that no one had anticipated until then. And his first big satellite production came in 1984 with Good Morning, Mr. Orwell. And it aired on January 1st, 1984. And it linked Paris with New York, but it was also broadcast in Korea, the Netherlands, and West Germany. And today is distributed as a video, which will also be in the show. And it was a kind of rebuttal to the very pessimistic notion of state surveillance and George Orwell's novel, and rather countering that sort of dystopian future in telecommunications, surveillance, and politics with a sense of playfulness and collaboration that involved as much his friends, his old time and long and very dear friends, as well as the stars of electronic music at the time, precisely people like Philip Glass, Laurie Anderson, and others. So he brought his friends into the same platform and the same program as these pop stars, and he really rejoiced in that hybrid mix where he provided graphics and playful interventions, but where he really showed the way for artists to not think that a program on national or even global television would necessarily compromise their integrity, which is something to discuss maybe later on. So let's move on to maybe one quote here, which I grappled with for a long time, and I'm still not quite sure I understand. But regarding Satellite, his very sort of Eastern humorous take on this was, the first quote, "The first step for a ninja is learning how to shorten distances by shrinking the earth. For a satellite, that is a piece of cake." So how to think a ninja and a satellite in the same sentence is something I may never understand, but it really seems such a productive moment to quote that in a show. Here, of course, you see Merce Cunningham pictured, and as I said earlier, Cunningham and Cage were two collaborators of him to whom we dedicate an entire gallery in the show. And the next one, I'm going to come to a close. And remember his sort of offhand dismissal of the sublime, and also that he, of course, was not that serious about it. But he continued to do even larger scale satellite projects. Here you see Lou Reed performing in Bye Bye Kipling. Another one 2 years later in '88 was Wrap Around the World for the Korean or Seoul Olympics. And all of that culminated, if you will, and let's move on to the next one, in a really massive scale immersive installation that was premiered in Venice in 1993 called Sistine Chapel. This may not be on your radar anymore, but the Sistine Chapel had undergone renovation, and it was heavily, the conservators were heavily criticized for reintroducing bright colors and bringing it back to a dubious original format. So he responded to that whole cultural development in in Italy, by pointing also to Venice as a site of commerce and one of the first global centers for commerce. The distinction then being now in 1993, commerce is in pictures, is in electronic images, is in programs, is in software, is not so much in hardware anymore. And he literally threw this around the room for videos, and the next piece, the next picture, shows us what the kind of reconstruction we did for that, for this retrospective. The first time someone has tried to reconstruct it in close collaboration with the estate and his former assistant, John Hoffman. Here you see the Tate's format, the Tate's installation. You immediately see that, of course, the hardware infrastructure has become much lighter, much slimmer, much more elegant, maybe. But what continues to impress and to really challenge us is that Paik did not care for any kind of realistic or naturalistic simulation, any kind of seamless, overwhelming gesture of a virtual space. No, his pictures would be thrown against the wall, would interfere with each other, would overlap and would be blurry and would occupy this space in what I can only call an unruly manner. There are moments of great audio explosions as well as silences in this. And all of that is far removed from any kind of architectural mapping that can be so well and so seamlessly done today with software. This is going to be one of the highlights of the show, and hopefully will meet a public that does not actually feel overwhelmed by the sheer pacing and the sheer complexity of his aesthetic, his whole visual language that is based on constantly transforming an image as opposed to just recording it and representing it. Things are always layered, things are always complex. Just like in his language, things are always a mix of cultural references, some of which you may get, others that may be beyond your horizon. That kind of aesthetic has often been called electronic wallpaper. I like Paik's own take on this, an own term for this much better, which is called Gestalt. He actually felt that you were wrapped around a massaging of your senses that made you feel things, made you sense things, but it may not be legible in all its complexity. So concluding this, I would say, coming back to television, he clearly did not change the course of television, the structure of television, its consumerism or its flattening of culture. But what he did do was he really pointed the way to two-way communication, to an insistence on participation and collaboration. And he basically is still sending today a very, I think, contemporary message, which is that you are not defined by the medium that you use. You're not defined by television. You are defined by who you are, by your artistic integrity and your artistic tool set, your language, if you will. And that language is not necessarily antagonistic to mass media. He also pointedly said, you can't do this alone. There is always the other. In his case, for example, the engineer, Shuya Abe, his lifelong friend and collaborator. And with that in mind, I would finish my presentation by inviting you to get ready to play back a Beatles song. This is a reminder of the participatory notion of video commune. Commune obviously being a very hip term in around 1970, in which he would invite people to participate in a live broadcast. And today we have the rare opportunity to be all in a narrow cast, if you will, through our Zoom meeting here. But we are in all parts of the world, maybe, I'm not sure, but certainly in all parts of the Bay Area. So we're going to run a just over 3-minute excerpt of this, which is silent. And you just play your Beatles, your favorite Beatles soundtrack to that. And you're welcome to add comments in the chat on what you chose and how that played out for you. Okay, I think we can stop here. Thank you. I think, I don't know who takes over now.
Hi, I'll step in. I'm not going to take over. Rudolf, that was absolutely incredible. As I said, it was going to be rigorous and it was going to be adventurous, and you were true to form. Thank you so much for this incredible lecture, and also this this taste of an actual experience of a piece here at the end. I'll say at the side, we almost didn't get to use this piece. We were waiting for approval from Electronic Arts Intermix, and we'll be hearing from the director of that entity next week. And so I'm really glad that here at the end we could, everyone could queue up a Beatles song. Some of you are sharing the titles in the chat, sometimes just to panelists and sometimes to panelists and attendees. And I wonder, even if before we go to formal Q&A, if there's a way to unmute anybody who might be able just to share some thoughts, no right or wrong answers about what the last 4 minutes were for you in Rudolf's talk, what came forward for you. And Edgar and Casey are here looking for raised hands or anyone who might be willing to be unmuted.
Christopher, do you want to start?
Yeah. Hi. Pleasure having you, Rudolph. Thank you for joining our class today. So the song that I chose was Michelle by the Beatles, of course. And I kind of, once I read the description of what today's course was, it kind of reminded me, because I heard of a story about it, that this song was supposedly dedicated, that John Lennon wasn't in love with a French girl and he dedicated his song to her, but he didn't know any French. So he wrote this song, and the only words he knew was Misha, my belle, ventre, ben le son. So while I was playing the video, right, every time the girl appeared, for some reason, Michelle, the same lyrics matched. So I kind of was like parallel with the same song. So I was kind of having a visual of like softness and a lot of blues, because it's a really like love song. And I don't know, I just felt a really good connection with my song, even though the video wasn't really dedicated towards the song. And it was kind of, I don't know, it was kind of like a weird feeling.
Weird is always good.
But I mean, it is, you know, thinking, we can actually just sort of think about why does it feel weird, but also it's almost like uncanny how there might be a kind of unexpected match between something that you're choosing and something that you're also receiving. Again, what it is to be participatory in a medium that isn't usually participatory. Any other thoughts from anyone?
Yeah, David?
Yeah, liberating, really liberating. While I've been listening and watching to Rudolf talk, I'm also working on a painting, and there's something about the song Come Together and the visuals in Paik's piece that were, you know, I was literally kind of jumping up and moving around my studio, and just, you know, being in the studio can be really solitary, but suddenly it felt like universal and yes, liberating. So thanks.
David, I didn't know you painted.
You know, it's a return to painting that has happened in the pandemic, and it's been really kind of a remarkable thing.
Students will put in the chat a link to David's studio. He's usually known for being a photographer. Thank you, David. That was awesome.
John Sanborn, I see your name pop up. John was an actual collaborator of Nam June way back. Are you still there with us? Looks like he just left.
Could be.
Oh,
yeah.
I've just given him permission to speak if you want to join in, John.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, John. All right. So we'll continue with Q&A and questions that are coming up. Maybe I'll just start off with one, Rudolf, because you really sounded a lot of times this element of Paik that is both resistant to mass media and resistant to certain forms, but also not only resistant, that he's inclusive in an interesting way. It came up a lot of times. I mean, one of the times was also when you talked about the mixing of artists with so-called celebrity and the notion that that combo wouldn't compromise anyone's practice. And you said, you know, maybe we could talk a little bit more about that. But I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that combo.
Yeah. A part of Video Commune that we did not see was that for technical reasons, the synthesizer from time to time had to reset. So I needed a break in the program. And I thought, well, you know, the break, we usually play commercials. And Paik insisted on just airing Japanese commercials, you know, not captioned. You know, of course, nobody would understand what was being said. I mean, apart, you know, if you could speak Japanese. And he felt that that was an important moment to recognize that we are globally watching television. We are globally subsumed under the, you know, the same sort of logic and the same kind of programming, the same commercialization and so on. And that it is an expression of that global nature of electronic images that can travel around the world, that why not have Japanese commercials? Why not? And while you may not buy that product or may not be able to buy that product, that is still a moment of our contemporary or then contemporary experience. And I think today we are so much more attuned to that sort of parallel universe where things come into our feed from wherever, you know, Asia or Latin America, and oftentimes I personally even have to remind myself when I see something pop up on my Facebook feed, for example, and it's in French. And while I can read French to some extent, I still think, shouldn't this be in English? No, it should not. And this idea that you have multiple layers in an image, as well as maybe parallel modes of signification in the same image or on the same text, that, you know, I majored in James Joyce, so I love the confluence of languages and the creation of new words out of that. And it really points us very directly and oftentimes beautifully, I think, to the fact that we cannot understand everything, that we have to necessarily, almost by default, move forward with our own interpretation and trust that. That's what I find is sort of a challenge for some in Paik, in the sheer complexity, dealing with that complexity, but then also he helps us. He is sweet in that he also offers us these beautiful minimalist sculptures or drawings for that matter.
Wonderful, thank you, thank you. Maybe just I'll pushing that perhaps a little farther, this notion of what a global conversation is. There's a couple of questions queuing up around the specifically Asian influence, about how much he welcomed versus how much he did not welcome a notion of his work as an East meets West conversation. That partly to respond to some questions posed by Catherine Meeser. And then also along the way, whether in putting together the exhibition or other parts of your research, if the exhibition is thinking at all about Paik's collaboration with Kubota, with his longtime partner Kubota, and what that means in terms of gender politics, as well as just collaboration in general.
Okay, let me start with the last one. I think that chapter still needs to be written, Paik and Kubota, in many ways. She is among his collaborators in a video called Merce by Merce on Merce Cunningham, and she collaborated for a second part in that. But we decided for many reasons to actually place the emphasis on Charlotte Moorman because it had such a massive influence on almost his entire career from the mid-60s to until she died in the early 90s. And that is also about very much about agency, and one can probably attach a number of different lenses to that. And I think we were interested in also finding Charlotte's voice in this, in the way that she embraced her agency in this, not being just denuded as an object on stage. And that was partly a reason why I chose my opening slide with Nam June Paik being the object of her making music in this take on sort of embodiment of a cello, if you will. And Paik did that himself. You know, he was demanding, but he was also demanding in the sense that he said, you know, we need to introduce sex in music. Sex is everywhere in literature and film, but not in music. Why not? So that was part of his mission. And he did that most of the time through humor. But the lesson that he learned and adapted so well, that he learned from Cage, was if you take these propositions like 4 minutes, 33 seconds or other compositions just as humor and as a gesture, you're missing the point. This is actually about serious music, and you have to perform that seriously. And what continuously emerges through, you know, when you engage with Charlotte's quotes and interviews and so on, is that she said, you know, you have to be serious about classical music. You have to be serious about those rules in order for you to be able to break them and to go beyond them. And that's what they were trying to do. And yes, she was arrested in New York for indecency. Well, anyway, that's a different story. But Paik was really committed to helping her because in the end, being part of that group of radical avant-garde artists and festivals and the whole new music circus, she did not have engagements as a classic cellist anymore. So she, in that sense, economically, she suffered. And so he continued to support her whenever he could throughout his life.
Sorry, and just the follow-up question around Asian influence and specifically Buddhism.
Yeah, yes. Well, for one, I'm not a scholar in this. I'm not an expert in this at all. I would say that if you imagine for a moment what it meant to be a Korean, not yet famous Korean music student, and then performer, and then artist in Germany, I think he felt that he was almost like an alien. He was that other person inside that post-war Germany. And yet he carved out a role for himself by playfully juggling those components of maybe prejudices, of preconceived notions of what an Asian influence might be, and and he also said, you know, shamans are as much charlatans as anything else, you know. So it's he had a very non-religious commitment to those ideas, very much indebted to a deep knowledge of not only Western classical music and philosophy, but also obviously Eastern philosophy. And unfortunately, I can't read a lot of what he digested in his readings, but he continued to basically say, also the second satellite project that I mentioned, Bye Bye Kipling, is a quote by Rudyard Kipling, that East and West and the twain shall never meet, or something like that. And he said, well, Bye Bye Kipling, that's wrong. You know, we move beyond that. We do meet, in fact. And what emerges in those meeting points is not a sort of a religious attachment to Buddhism. It's not a uncritical attachment to technology. It is a mixing of all these influences in ways that we can't quite understand yet, but we have to do them, we have to try them. And I think that's what ultimately defined the way that he generated his visual language. So why is there Japanese commercial in Video Commune? Because that is in the same realm of possibility, like you can have a shaman and a commercial in the same videotape, or you can have Laurie Anderson next to a shaman, or then Allen Ginsberg chanting his Buddhist inspired songs. Not that, I wouldn't say that anything goes. I wouldn't take it that far, because ultimately he would still always make this part of his language. But his language was complex, and he was a constant, I mean, we would call him the first truly global artist, in that he not only combined a cultural heritage that was as much Eastern, obviously, through his upbringing, as it was Western through his studies and his life. But he also made that a constant topic for his art. He addressed the fact that this was a global enterprise, and the ways that he has been quoted often, time and again, as a visionary of the internet age, you know, electronic superhighway and whatnot, media planning for the 21st century, written in 1974, was visionary by all means. Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but let's move on to some other questions.
Wonderful. Edgar and Casey, do you see things brewing in the chat, or that you wanted to share, or have something yourself?
Yeah, well, we have one great comment from Michelle, which is a question that I had as well. And it's something that we've been circling around a little bit, but about how appropriate this work seems to this moment, this sort of Zoom moment. You think about how so many of these works are about intervening in the sort of unidirectionality of broadcast. And now we have this, you know, two-way communication. I mean, so, yeah, so what do you think? Yeah.
Thanks for bringing this up. This was somewhere in my notes. I wanted to, again, congratulate all of you for this amazing William Pope L performance that he did, staged by UC Berkeley. And the way that he interacted with the screen, that is precisely the lesson by Paik, by Douglas Davis and others, that of course we are distant, and of course it's a screen, but it shouldn't limit you. And I do think he was maybe faster in adopting those modes of engaging, or those tools and technologies, than a lot of artists are today. I'm not sure. I still haven't. I'm looking at all of you. I still haven't seen the one Zoom artist. You know, what a terrible word to say. You don't want to be a Zoom artist, but you know, artists dealing with this moment through the technologies that emerge in this moment, without being confined or maybe limited to a simple technological exploration of that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think kind of going along with what you were saying, I'm looking at in the Q&A, Patricia talks about the idea that, you know, Paik's sculptures were introducing some sort of friction into an increasingly disembodied media, and then kind of thinking about where we are in this moment now, and is saying that, you know, the idea of having a physical encounter with one of Paik's pieces within the defined space of a gallery following such a long period of isolation, it may be a shock to the system. And so thinking about like that as like part of Paik's practice of that shock or that kind of transformation, that I think a lot of the work that we've kind of been talking about, those moments where the unexpected comes in. And just saying that as a comment, and also wanting to bring in Joseph's question of asking if there's any influence for Paik from McLuhan, maybe cybernetics, if any.
You mean cybernetic theory? Oh, definitely. I mean, McLuhan is everywhere in the 60s, so it's hard to not see that. And his entire language at the time, talking about feedback and two-way communication and so on, goes, however, I would say, there were artists who engaged with that specifically and sort of set up projects of, let's say, communication networks or communication events. And I think he was equally interested in that, but he would always do a Paik thing. It would always be a Paik mismatch, almost a Paik jarring glitch, or he was not interested in the seamlessness of communication. That's the best I can say for now. But the idea that if you want to make a name for yourself, just don't take products off the shelf. I think that's probably a good advice for any artist somehow invested in technology. So if he hadn't met Shui Abe, who knows? He was trying himself. He once said, you know, I shelled out 20 marks or something, which at the time was a lot of money, for a manual to build my own video recorder, which then was fake. It didn't work. So he tried, you know, he was do-it-yourself in many ways. But whenever he could, he would really rely upon a sense of collaboration. Ideally with Shui Abe, that was for a lifelong collaboration. He was obviously friends with that whole early era and early group of pioneers like Woody and Steiner Vazulka and others, who would also work on creating their own machines. But still, you have to first have this idea that you want to bring a music generator into a circuit with a television cathode ray tube and just see what kind of effects that brings. So you bring in two things that do not share a language, that do not share circuits, and you somehow create a short circuit there. And that produces possibly something interesting.
I actually have a sort of a follow-up question to this idea of technology and medium specificity in Paik's work. Zane asks, he says, you mentioned that Paik believed that an artist was not defined simply by the medium that they were confined to. How do you think that the use of many different forms allowed him to create participation with the public?
different forms, like different media, or
So, yeah.
I think what I hear is also that he comes from music, that he is, you know, also
Yes.
engaged in sculpture. He's engaged with television. It's like a range.
Yes. Well, you know, his first musical act, public act, was to perform homage at John Cage, and John Cage was present, and he would then cut off his tie unannounced. Like, boys would just trash his piano in the show, and you know, it's probably hard to call that participation, but it was a physical engagement for sure, and he clearly devised, since '63, he devised setups, technological setups, by which the public was enabled to perform their own performativity, if you will. You know, like the short excerpt we saw with Participation TV, where you sing or speak into a microphone. And I remember we showed that in the show that Shannon mentioned earlier, The Art of Participation, in 2008. And our, you know, conservators and you know, the whole crew said, well, you know, you cannot touch, this is alone, you cannot touch the microphone. Said, well, look, you're missing the point. This is all about actually speaking into the microphone and singing. So it still runs very much counter to a lot of practices that are maybe based on the notion of preserving things, of making things last, possibly forever. And of course, in his music, I mean, it was also the late 50s and early 60s. It was post-war Germany, so it was a lot about almost shocking the undisrupted culture of classic music, and not recognizing and not acknowledging that a major traumatic event had happened, and all of that was still very much in the air and at play in the discussions as well as in the artistic practices. And I think I'm losing my thread now here, where I'm going with this. Yeah, maybe another follow-up question, or.
I think that you know, as you were talking, you it seems in some ways it even goes back to the, you know, comment about McLuhan. The students know I gave a quick and dirty intro to thinking about McLuhan's ideas, but the phrase that gets said all the time, and you know, we sort of forget how actually revolutionary it is, the notion of the medium being the message, just keeps coming back over and over again in so many different ways. So, and also that the intermedia is the message, but but this fact, when you say that you can't take anything off the shelf, that seems to go for a composition, for a television screen, for a video camera, for a stage set, that nothing, that the intervention in the medium is is both an investigation of the delivery system. The delivery system with which you're communicating is also the object of your attention. And that seems to be, we keep hearing that over and over in different ways from the more contemporary artists we're looking at now. And just to remember how much Paik pushed that conversation or launched that conversation, you know, before so many others.
Yes. Well, I mentioned the word Gestalt, and the way that something works on you, something massages you, which is also directly taken from McLuhan. That is a once you adapt to that philosophy and that practice, the fact that the projector might be slightly off is actually not important anymore. it is the precision of execution in the form is not that important anymore. Although, yes, he was minimalist in many ways. I give you one example, which actually directly relates to one of the works in the Kramlich collection. They also have a TV Buddha, arguably one of his most famous pieces, but he made many TV Buddhas. So they have a later one, and it was shown a few years ago in a show, and I was not involved in that. So I came to see it, and I saw a, underneath the monitor, I saw a little wedge. Yes, exactly. That's the piece. Under the monitor, I saw a little wedge, a little wooden wedge, and I thought, Jesus, somebody forgot to take this off. And then I asked, like, what a sloppy job, in other words. And then I told this to John Hoffman, who'd worked with Nam June for many, many years. And he said, no, he always let something be there that was disrupting the precision, the final form. And, again, another super famous quote by him is, when too perfect, lieber Gott böse, dear God is angry. So it's also okay to have 70% or 85% or 40%. Just, look beyond that. Just look at, and not only the gesture, but also look at the way that you come out of this, the way that you feel with this. And that said, I'm almost going to contradict myself now towards the end, but I do want to say what we really need is a much more rigorous analysis, almost like an art historical analysis of what actually happens when you experience this. So to all those students out there with you, I would urge you, if you feel connected to whatever might be in the show for you, just really go into the details of that and try to analyze that. And you will see the sheer complexity of the most minimalist gesture or the most minimalist sculpture is mind-boggling. And once you start going down that rabbit hole, and you come out the other end, if you come out the other end, it is so rewarding because no one has actually really analyzed the kind of montage he did, the kind of layering he did. And I'm saying this because I just made this big plea for looking at the Gestalt, looking holistically at the effects. But I think it is an art historical duty to also go into the depth of the image production and the way that what this means in terms of images speaking to other images.
Rudolf, you have contributed today to that art historical adventure and been so eloquent, actually, and so precise about the impact of imprecision. And I think inspire us all to re-engage with Paik, and we're all going to get to when SFMOMA opens again with this exhibition. Everyone
May
is
8th.
really, okay, May 8th, everybody really well primed. And once again, I couldn't be more thankful to have you here. I know that the audience is as well. Help me thank Rudolf for such an incredible disquisition today at noon PST and much later in the evening in Europe and elsewhere where I've seen other people have been tuning in. Thank you, Rudolf.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in as well.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.